Ladies and gentlemen, welcome for the next session. As you see, that will be a session also on sustainability, but important subjects that will be discussed are the corporate purpose and the role of the shareholders. And we have heard a lot about that already, but we will go in it and explore the issue a little bit further. The setup is a little bit different from what we had on the first session. We agreed among the speakers that they will give their presentations, all three of them first, and then we will have 45 minutes for discussion. And the speakers will sit next to each other. So it will give you the freedom to ask a question to more speakers as well. And we hope to have a very good discussion with you and between the speakers. The first speaker that I may announce is Professor Mieke Olaerts, professor at the University of Maastricht. And she is an eminent professor in this field. And it's a great pleasure to announce her here and to give her the floor.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm hoping that people online can hear me. Is that all good? Perfect. Okay, many thanks. What I would like to talk about today is go a bit to the Dutch context and talk about research that we've done on sustainability embedding in Dutch listed companies. I'm hoping that this will give a little bit of a background on the discussion that we're having in terms of, do we need sustainable corporate governance, and if so, in which way? All of these bigger questions will not be answered by these data or by my presentation, but we have 2 days. So let's hope that by tomorrow we will have all of our answers put together. So I'm hoping that these questions that I just posed are questions that we could use later on in the discussion as well. The background of what I want to talk about today is, as I said, this research that we've done into sustainability embedding in Dutch listed companies. And I wanted to focus on, there's more in that research, but I wanted to focus on 3 areas that we've also been discussing already in a previous panel. It's purpose, strategy, and then governance and leadership. And from there on, I wanted to start the discussion a bit and talk, and also see what you think about the road ahead. So as I said, a bit, well, first of all, a bit the background. I don't think we have to dwell too much on that, in the sense that this has already been mentioned before. There are developments coming up, legislative developments. I'll turn to them later on in the presentation as well. But the due diligence directive, or the draft, has already been mentioned. CSRD and the Dutch Corporate Governance Code is being revised. And one of the issues that is on the proposal is to include also ESG strategies and ESG targets. Now, against this background, we at Maastricht University did research into last year, 2021, into sustainability embedding practices. And it was research which was commissioned by Eumedion. And it was done by, I see that the names are really, really small on the report. It was done by Rob and Teresa Bauer, unrelated to each other, just accidentally have the same name. It's apparently a very popular name in Europe. Constantijn van Aertsen and myself. So this was a research group that was involved. And what we did was we looked at a sample of 35 companies who were asked to participate in this research, and also voluntarily participated in the research. It was based on desk research and interviews. And the goal was to get an overview of sustainability embedding practices. So to see a bit, where are we at now? If you look at the proposals that are coming from Europe. And we did that based on a very broad definition of what is sustainability, because there's so many things that you can see as sustainability. Beate already mentioned it in her presentation as well. So we decided to take a very big, an approach with a very broad definition. These are the participating companies. You can all read that online in a report. So I'm going to quickly go through that and focus on the main issues that I wanted to discuss for today. And one of them is the topic that we already discussed earlier, purpose. What we looked at was, given the debate on corporate purpose, what do companies do in terms of, or at least the companies in our sample, what do they do in terms of purpose? And there's many more numbers in these tables, given that today our chairman has announced that he has a very strict day, is going to be very strict in time management. I won't take you through all of these numbers, but if you're interested, you can always ask me in the debate part. That's how speakers get extra speaking time. So let me know if there's anything interesting that you want to know more about. Corporate purpose, and there's in a Dutch context differences between corporate purposes in terms of you can have a corporate purpose which is somewhere on your corporate website or just that. It's more of a slogan, more of a broader corporate purpose, or you can have it in your articles of association as your objective clause, basically. This part of the research is the result of the broader idea of corporate purpose. So purposes that we found in annual reports, websites, etc. When we looked at these corporate purposes with a broad definition of purpose, broad definition of sustainability, we found that around 82% of the companies that we had in our sample have a corporate purpose, which includes directly or indirectly sustainability, which is quite a good result, you would say. That's fantastic. But we also know that there's a lot of criticism in the literature, as we heard before, that purposes are often very, very broad. So the first thing that we encountered was that it was quite difficult to distinguish in practice between a corporate mission or a purpose or a vision. As some companies name it a corporate purpose, others leave it more up to you to decide whether it's their vision or mission. But this is something which we at least found problematic, difficult to distinguish. Another thing is that these purpose formulations, we try to check, can we make them more specific? Can we see whether or not they are indeed too vague and broad, or can we make them more specific? In order to test that, we looked at the literature and we came up with texts by Myers and Edmonds, and we already talked about that in the first panel. Meyer already explained to us that a company has to have solve a problem. It has to have a purpose in which you don't create problems, you solve problems. If you add to that also a little bit of Edmonds, then he says, well, you need to have a who and a why. You need to explain what your material stakeholders are, for who you do this, and why you do this, what your competitive advantage is. If we check then what we see in the corporate purposes that we found, then we see that basically 16 companies had a purpose that solves a potential problem. 16 have identified material stakeholder groups, which is again a good score. On the other hand, when you look at these stakeholder groups, they're very, very broadly defined. So it can mean future generations, for example, our customers, things like that. So this was really, really broad. If we interpret it more strictly and we want a very specific shareholder and we want a very specific corporate problem solved, then or societal problem solved, then we end up with 2 companies that satisfied this test. This is another thing on corporate purpose, and that's research that it's a different sample. It's a research that I did together with Professor Bastiaan Kemp, my colleague in Maastricht. And here we looked at the objective clauses, so at the Articles of Association of Dutch listed companies. So we took all Dutch incorporated companies listed with domestic and foreign listing, and we checked what are their object clauses in their Articles of Association to see, do they have a more specific purpose there? And there we found that basically a lot of companies have very broad generic objectives. So generic objectives can mean we lend money to our subsidiaries, for example, you know, that kind of really broad clauses. We do in, we buy real estate, etc. Large clauses. The amount of companies that referred to society was very, very small. And even with those companies, it was often companies that already have a product, which is, for example, wind energy, or which has something to do with society, pharmacy, etc. So things where there's a clear link. References to stakeholders were also very, very small and often very generic as well again. So customers, very broad references. And then we did find 7 companies that really reference to shareholder interests. So that really say in their objectives, in their Articles of Association, shareholder interest is what we aim for. Then let's move on to strategy, because as we said already in the first panel, it's not only about purpose, we also need to look at strategy and leadership. If you look at strategy, then we saw that 97% of the companies, and I'm now back in the smaller sample, so it's only the 35 companies that we looked at, the previous research that I was telling you about. There we saw that 97% of the companies have sustainability related strategic objectives, but they are pretty scattered and very different. They are also different in terms of deadlines that they pose to it. So some companies are really clear about the targets that they have and set specific deadlines for it. But it also depends on which type of targets. So some do it for some targets, some do it for all. And we saw that half of the companies do it for all their sustainability targets. And when it comes to reporting, because that's also something that if you look at the draft CSRD, the idea is you set targets and you report on what you've achieved. Same in the corporate governance code on ESG, or at least a proposal. And then we saw that half of the companies report on what they've been doing over the past years in terms of their targets. But for many companies, this is still a relatively new thing. We saw also that there's a lot of differences in terms of the targets that they choose. We didn't check all of the targets, but what we specifically took out was, for example, CO2 neutrality. We looked at biodiversity and we looked at circularity. And there we see that companies are much more prone to be specific about CO2 and also set specific targets to CO2 related issues. But when it comes to biodiversity and circularity, it's much more unclear or it's broader. They have policies on it, they have or objectives, specific projects, same for commitments on circularity, but they're not as specific as CO2 reduction. And then the last topic that we checked for was leadership and governance, because also in the first panel, it was already said, we should do something about our leaders. That's leading by example. Leadership is very important. If you want to create a culture, you need a specific leadership. So we looked at what can we find about board composition and about the role of the boards, because if you look at the proposal for the CSRD, there it's also stated that you need to disclose what the role is of your supervisory board and your board of directors in terms of sustainability. And there we found that we didn't find many company management board profiles in publicly available information. So board profiles was really something that we almost didn't find. We found 7 of them and all 7 included sustainability in a general manner. But for the rest, we didn't find it. We found board allocation. So we found 29, how do you call it? Bestuursreglementen, 29 regulations for the board. And out of those 29, 27 allocated sustainability to the board or the top management. We looked at the same thing for supervisory boards. There we found all profiles, but we see that only half, or that half does not have a reference to sustainability in board composition. So the requirements for supervisory board members. And we see that, so that's relatively low. We did see that oversight over sustainability is something that is awarded as a task to the supervisory board. Although from the companies, from the companies that we found, we saw that 8 companies only refer to diversity. So sustainability as in the diversity aspect, so that they say supervisory board, you have to make sure that there's a policy on diversity and not much more on sustainability. And that leads me to my last slide, and I have 3 more minutes, so I think we're gonna be okay. My last slide is on where do we go from here? What do we want in terms of sustainability governance or sustainability corporate governance in our corporate governance rules? If we look at what we found in this research, then I think at least when it comes to transparency and reporting, and especially if tomorrow and later on today, we talk about the role of investors and we want a stronger role for investors on these issues, then we need more reporting, because we right now see that this is quite, there's a lot of reporting, but it's quite, companies are different, very different in the ambition levels, in what they say about it, how clear they are about it, and setting their ambition levels, especially on these 3 issues, CO2, biodiversity, circularity. When it comes to the task allocation and composition of the board, there I think we can have a very interesting debate, and we already started it in the first panel on, do we really require boards of directors to have sustainability knowledge? Should you have it in a supervisory board, on the board of directors, executives, non-executives? And how do we make sure that these people have that background? I think there we can talk a bit more about, but I think that Professor Windsor is going to talk about that as well later on. So perhaps during the discussion, we can also talk about that. Don't want to say too much about it. What I do think is if CSRD requires you to say something about the task of the board in sustainability, then I do think that we have to be a bit more specific on what we want to see, because otherwise it's going to be, it can be a general phrase saying sustainability is something that the board looks at. And then the question is, does that get us very, very far? And then the last issue, purpose, where do we have to go with purpose? Also there, I won't dwell too much because I'm down to 0 minutes. I think purpose is important, but purpose only works if it's authentic. And if purpose is authentic, I would say, then make the choice to commit yourself to purpose and put it in your articles of association. Not saying that we have to mandate it for every company, just saying that if you're serious about purpose, put it in your articles of association, engage your shareholders in it, engage your stakeholders in it. Make sure that you also put it in strategy and in your corporate culture. But this was already said before, I think it can help, especially in a Dutch context, against takeovers, which could lead to sustainability value destruction, perhaps. So with that, I will finish my presentation.
Many thanks, Mieke. As said, there will be plenty of time for discussion after the three speakers have made their presentation. And it's my pleasure to have the second speaker in this panel, Professor Jaap Winter, my dear colleague here at the University of Amsterdam. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harm-Jan. And my pleasure to be here with you to talk about one aspect that I've been writing about and thinking and discussing and debating and being attacked about quite a bit in this country, about the duty of the board. I call it a duty of societal responsibility of the board. And for me, this has been a long road. And some of you who know me know that I, in 2002, chaired a committee, the high level group, which for the European Union said shareholders should have a more prominent position in the corporate governance. And they should. That was our thinking then. And I think it helped solve a corporate governance question of principle. Sorry, I have to stay here. Sorry, okay. Okay. I remember the cameras there, high camera. And it's helped solve a problem or address a certain issue of principal agent questions that we were thinking about then. There's been a consequence of then that I did not see then in 2002, to be honest. We were not worried about that then, at least I wasn't, about substantial issues of climate and effects of corporate conduct beyond the own corporate remit. And I think we've come slowly to the point that we have to become sensitive to those issues and to those questions, and how do we address that in corporate law as well? For me, that's been a journey. It's not been an overnight sort of thing. Now I know how it is. It's a sort of process, imagining what it is that we're actually dealing with. When I had this straight for myself, finally, I can say, and I've been working on different papers about remuneration. Jennifer, we just spoke about that, how it doesn't work, variable pay. It's a sort of excessive mechanism that actually doesn't help corporations. At the start of the COVID crisis, I wrote a paper addressing the crisis of the modern corporation, thinking about this duty of societal responsibility of the board, thinking that how we got ourselves in the corporate sphere be dominated by this shareholder primacy view. Beata talked about it in the previous panel, basically saying that everything else, every other concern that we should have that does not yield value to shareholders is an externality that is not our concern, unless the regulator or public opinion or some outside force tells us and forces us to take this into account. That has become more than at least I have ever anticipated, and I think we're all part of that. I'm certainly not excluding myself of that, but much more than I have ever anticipated, a sort of idol that we have started to worship in our corporate law thinking, in our international discussions about corporate law, as something, and that's the notion of an idol. If you read wonderful books of Eric Fromm about that, an idol is created by man and then put above man to worship it, as if there is no other alternative. The golden calf and Jewish people in the desert, etc. That's a sort of symbol of idol. We create it ourselves, then we start to worship it. And once we start to worship it, we believe we must worship it because otherwise we're lost. We're desperate. And I think that's a little bit what's happened with the way that we, from a theoretical principal agent perspective on corporate governance, have imposed a reality on corporations that has become reality in practice. And I sat on boards of listed companies, I've advised them many times, and you can see how it has become a mechanism of belief. It's a conviction that this is what we need to do. We need to create shareholder value, and our remuneration must be set on that basis. Obviously knowing that that actually gives us the most access to high remuneration. That's the corollary of the whole process. It has become an idol, and we started to worship it, and we no longer connect with what society actually wants. In that system, more than we want to acknowledge very often, and much more than we feel comfortable with, we basically exclude ourselves from moral decisions. We say moral decisions is not part of our duties. These are all externalities. Unless regulation tells us what we can no longer do or what we must do, it basically means we don't have to make that sort of judgment. We just are there to promote our own financial success, ultimately for the benefit of shareholders. And that creates a disconnect with society, and society feels it. And that's what corporations are struggling with, the constant criticism in society against corporate conduct. It comes from somewhere because we have somehow disconnected ourselves. And corporate law, and the way that we have been starting to think and develop and build upon structures in corporate law, have added to this, have facilitated this. If you bring that back to the Dutch context, some would argue, and some have argued when I wrote this, actually, this does not apply to the Netherlands because we have this stakeholder approach. And Beate already said, be careful with this dichotomy between shareholder and stakeholder approach. It might lead you nowhere, but we use it when we start to talk about this. And some have argued, if you look at the Dutch context, that actually this is not a problem for us because we have a stakeholder approach. If you look carefully what that stakeholder approach is, and there are many interpretations of this, but one, at least authoritative one, should be the one of the Supreme Court in one of the most recent decisions in 2014. It actually it extends this notion of stakeholder thinking only to those stakeholders who have some connection directly with the corporation itself. You can call them internal stakeholders. Employees are very much on our mind in the Netherlands. We've built corporate law structures with co-determination structures, etc., built on the notion that employees have some justified position within corporate law. Creditors will have it too. Certainly when insolvency looms, creditors become at the foremost of our thinking in corporate law. But it doesn't go much farther than that. If you read the decision of the Supreme Court, the interest of the company is what basically is about the continued success of the company, but you have to balance that and make sure that the interest of those who are involved with the corporation and its business are not harmed unnecessarily or disproportionately. But those who have no connection at all with the corporation, but are affected by its conduct, and climate change is a mechanism that obviously generates that particular effect. People in very different places in the world can have an effect of your corporate conduct. And in terms biodiversity as well, you have no relation directly, you're not part of the structure of the corporation, and unless you're affected by it. And it doesn't seem, if you look at this judgment, that is included in the way that we currently think about the duties of directors. Some would interpret it more widely and say, actually, it's not just this, there is scope for external interest as well. Anyway, that remains to be seen, it's unclear. In my thinking, to get out of the stakeholder shareholder dichotomy, maybe we're moving into a new concept of the corporation, which I dubbed for myself as sort of open corporation. There's not a strict boundary around the corporation where its own concerns and interests stop and everything else is external and not relevant. It is becoming more and more relevant. And we need to figure out ways, and I'm not claiming that I know how exactly to do that, but we need to figure out ways in which the external world, and to the extent to which the external world can influence and should influence what is happening within the corporation and its decision making, whether that helps, whether that is done through corporate governance mechanisms, whether you allow other stakeholders to also have some form of say in whatever means in corporate governance, whether it is by action rights, a question in the previous panel, whether you allow external interested parties, stakeholders, if you wish, to have some sort of action right against the corporation if they believe that the conduct in a negatively way, in an unjustified way, it harms them, etc. We are at the process of thinking through what that transformation should be. I'm convinced that our current ways of thinking are not enough to get this done. I'm not saying it should be completely open and anything should go and the whole of the world is by definition also party in the governance and has action rights. That's not what I'm claiming, but we need to think about a new sort of balance that we haven't anticipated before. The concerns of the world, and I won't go into any detail, the concerns of the world in the sense are becoming the concerns of corporations. And this is because external regulation cannot ever, with enough precision, with enough accuracy, describe, prescribe, and prohibit what companies should and should not do ever. There will always be a space in which the leadership of a corporation will have to make judgments, because it is not yet clear in regulation what can and cannot be done. Because some new technology has never been described, but we can use it today and it has effects. And what do we think of those effects? There will be a question, a core element in corporate law to think about. So we proposed with a number of professors in the Netherlands to extend the duty of directors to act in the interest of the corporation with a specific knowledge. In doing so, they should ensure that the company acts in society as a responsible corporate citizen. We use somewhat different words in Dutch, but basically that's the notion. And these are open, this is an open norm clearly. It doesn't specify what it is. It simply puts the burden on directors. You have to think about this. You have to think of the external consequences of your conduct. And you have to explain to the outside world how you make those judgments. To what extent do you believe this is still the responsibility of the corporation? Where does it stop? You make the judgment. Directors in doing so have discretion as a normal feature of corporate law. In any corporate law system, you would have this business judgment rule or any other legal mechanism that we know that allows directors to make their own judgments there. We have a specific court case, the Supreme Court in 2013 saying the court, any court should be reluctant in judging if a body of the corporation has balanced the relevant interest in all reasonability and fairness, a sort of Dutch credo about how to do this, and has applied due care in doing so. But when the words that come to mind for us as lawyers that indicate that this is no longer the case are words like disproportionate harm. When a judge would say this is disproportionate of you, or you haven't even looked at it, you haven't even wondered whether your effect to third parties would be relevant for your decision. I think that's where the part comes where directors are at risk. There's been a lot of resistance in the business community against that proposal in the Netherlands for various reasons. One argument is we don't need it because we have a stakeholder model. And I worry about that. I'm not convinced that our current stakeholder model is wide enough to encompass the concerns that corporations should start to concern. The norm is too vague. It doesn't specify the outcome exactly because it cannot be specified. That's the responsibility of directors to make those judgments with the discretion that they have. And if they get it awfully wrong, unreasonably wrong, yes, that's where the law would probably intervene. It only creates high risk of liability and therefore uncertainty, and therefore it would stop people to actually engage in more sustainable practices. It's a higher risk environment if you put this up. I'm not sure that's the case, actually. Those who really want it can explain what they're doing, the sort of judgment that they make. Those who do not, but only say that they do, perhaps are at higher risk if we would introduce this law. That might be the case. And perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps we should want that. It's not a level playing field if we would only do this in Holland. Let's do it at least in the EU. Clear argument in any member state always, and it's a valid argument. Also put it in the corporate governance code. Don't make it too legal, but put it in the code as an aspiration, not so much as a legal norm, which has direct legal consequences, but as an aspiration of what you should be or should want to be. The same business community resists extremely strongly putting anything in the corporate governance code that would closely look like the word responsibility. So the same debate goes on. The minister in the Netherlands has said, and then I'll wrap up, upon the advice of an expert group, we're not going to do this now. Certainly, let's first look at what Europe comes up with, this level playing field argument. And again, it's a valid argument. Well, the European Union has come up with a proposal. In the due diligence directive, this Article 25, different words. And I, as a lawyer, we can argue extensively about the meaning of words and whether this would be actually much more accurate than the proposal we made. I don't really care about that. It's about the notion that directors, it is the duty of directors to make those judgments also about external consequences about their behavior, beyond their internal stakeholders. To have discretion, but when they abuse their discretion, there should be sanctions to it. This is what Europe proposes. We'll see whether that happens. Remains to be seen because the resistance is now also at EU level, obviously. There's one argument of resistance that I didn't mention yet, and Rientje will probably come back on that later on. Some institutional investors have said against this proposal, don't do this because we as investors will take care of it. We will push corporations to become sustainable, which is a strange thing if you sort of say the directors do not have an obligation to take this into account, but have to rely on their shareholders to push them to do so. And I don't buy it as an argument for not having this. I do buy that the investors want to take responsibility too, but that doesn't mean that directors of corporations shouldn't have it. Let me stop there. So was that within?
Many thanks, Jaap. And you actually offered the perfect bridge to announce our next speaker, Christoph van der Elst. And Christoph van der Elst will discuss the role of shareholders. And you will, yeah. Somebody's taking care of the IT here. Just my dear economic professor, Alessio. He knows everything about this method as well. Okay, Christoph is a professor at the University of Tilburg, but also at the University of Ghent in Belgium, and it's a great honor to have him here and to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Harm-Jan. Also, my special thanks to Alessio, to Søren, to Anne for organizing it. This is a joint work with Anne, and you already see what it is all about. As we have already discussed the board of directors and the company in the previous sessions, we of course are going to address now a little bit about the shareholders and the shareholders' role, and to what extent there is a difference in opinion between Jaap, and it seems to be also later onwards we're going to hear from Riens, to what extent that they should be involved. I guess they should be involved, of course. Now, okay, oh, wrong buttons. Now it should work. Okay, it works. So, of course, when we talk about shareholders, there are a lot of different types of shareholders, and it is often forgotten, and we're not going to develop as there is no this time constraint, but you see already many different types that have different interests. And they do something, of course, in particularly at different levels. Sometimes they take action invisible. Of course, they leave the company, and of course, strictly speaking, you can see that if they start selling, but actually do not necessarily know, or they have private meetings and negotiations. Secondly, also, there is the role of the general meeting at which you can vote, you can say something against, as it happened also in the Netherlands 2 months ago, against the remuneration of Philips, because it doesn't seem to be pleasing the shareholders. There are shareholder proposals, an interesting paper also published 2 months ago in a Dutch journal about how often it is being used. Not that frequently, it seems to be the case, at least not in the Netherlands. There are proxy fights, there are questions. There is a third element that is really visible, naming and shaming, public communication, suing the company, takeovers, all of that, which we will not develop. To do something, and I identified goal because I don't dare to use the word purpose anymore. It's too tricky, but ultimately shareholders also want to see something happen on different levels. It could be the E, the S, the G, it could be everything. Finally, of course, they would love to see also that the companies make some profit. That's still a little bit of an important feature. Now, ultimately, what in all these research hardly ever has been addressed is this one, shareholder questions. to what extent also do shareholders make use of this, let's say, very low cost feature? And that's something that we are starting to address in this research. In fact, in several steps. First of all, what we did is we identified Dutch companies. Dutch companies have the major advantage that a member of them, we selected them from the IX and the mid-caps, IMX, that they provide relatively detailed minutes of the meetings within which you can find, in fact, also questions and answers. I'm not aware that many other countries do, with the exception of Italy. In Italy also you have very detailed minutes. In fact, even more detailed than the Dutch one. Sometimes you find 1,000 pages on the minute with everything in it, because of course the Italians need a lot of words to say something. What we did is then, when that is not so easy, it sounds easy, but identifying all the questions and the answers, because sometimes it's a comment and then a response, is it really a question and so on, but we try to do that. And in fact, we then focused on, of course, specific sustainability, can I still use the word, sustainability questions. And we identified in these companies approximately during these meetings over time, approximately 1,000 of them. Not all of them have been answered, but a large majority of them have been answered. And as you can see, but you don't see it everywhere, the large majority of the questions were raised by the VBDO, which is also a Dutch association that in particularly emphasizes the role and the importance of sustainability. But also a number of institutional investors. And I have to say, being familiar with some other countries too, it's not that common to find at meetings institutional investors raise questions, at least not, for instance, in Belgium and France, you hardly ever see that. They do in the Netherlands. Also some other ones, shareholder associations like the VEB and so on, do raise questions. That's the second thing. The third thing that we then start to do is, of course, can we, one way or another, further address this issue and study it? And for that, we in fact made use of natural language processing. As you can see, NLP, which is in fact also trying to do some investigations by using language. Language is of course key. In fact, in criminology, in political science, of course in linguistics, they start using this technique already frequently. Not going to develop all of these things in every detail because of course a lot of possibilities are there available. We looked in particularly also at, and the first thing also at topic modeling, which is, we had to clean the data, of course, because you use stop words and the like, which are irrelevant. But of course, in order to make the computer make use of it, we, in this technique of unsupervised machine learning, they say, try to identify topics. And we make use of the computer doing that to identify whether there are questions that could be one way or another identified in accordance with topics. We didn't intervene, so here the machine is going. What is of importance, of course, is that afterwards we need to take a look at it to see that we might miss otherwise things that are hidden that we can't identify. But if you leave all these questions to the computer, it might be popping out. And there are 9 elements that have been identified. And of course, we then step in and try to identify what these topics could be all about. Like, for instance, if you take a look more in detail on these grouped topics, these elements, you could see more or less in number 5, as you see work, right, humans, and so on, human, that they could be seeing as a topic more or less related to human rights. So we did that in a second step. And of course, in a third step, we related then the questions to what does it actually fit within this topic modeling feature. It's a technique, this topic modeling, that helps us to better understand what is going on. In fact, I think later on, also Dionysia is using it for stewardship and did the same, used the same technique also for developing in stewardship. So it in fact is helping us in that perspective. That's the first way that I addressed it. The second thing, which in fact we didn't develop in all details here due to time constraints, is also we use sentiment analysis. So also see what type of questions are there, positive, negative, and so on. So, and one of these things that we already identified, not as to coming as a surprise to us, is when you study the answers, you find more positive answers than when you look at the questions, which is of course expected. So that the question is, we regret that you didn't do this, whilst the board will say, well, in fact, we did our best too, which is of course the typical answer you could expect. The next step that we did is that we try to identify to what extent this behavior at general meetings might in fact also be increasing the ESG criteria that we currently have. So what we then in a third step did is using and identifying the Refinitiv ESG scores. I know you could criticize them a lot. We all know that there is a lot of ESG critics say, how come that these ones are doing great and so on. Anyway, we know that, but we use them in order to, in particularly also trying to figure it out whether there is some kind of a correlation between questions and what is happening year after year at the board. At the general meeting, that year after year, for instance, at Heineken, VBDO is asking, when are you going to improve the working conditions of all your people around the world? Next year, when are you going to? And finally, in 2021, they have a policy, they in fact start to develop that. We put that into a model, meaning that we, of course, made use of the ESG criterion after that the AGM took place in order to figure out whether there could be some kind of an effect. Not going to bother you with all the details, the ins and outs. There are still a lot of elements that we need to further investigate. But at least what we found that there seems to be a positive impact correlation. I know we have to be tremendously careful in doing these econometrics, because what comes first, the chicken and the egg, we all know it. And to what extent are there other elements that are of importance to influence behavior and so on? We do know, but we try to, at least, as there is many corporate governance research in this area, to figure it out. And at least if it does help, even if it is correlation, that's not bad, that you could also steer as a shareholder via this mechanism. So there seems to be a positive effect. The more questions you raise, the better it helps. Lots of other elements are in there. We will be able to read that in the paper that we are preparing. Also, for instance, specifically, there seems to be, if you raise questions regarding human rights, it significantly, to a large extent, afterwards, seems to have a positive effect on the results in ESG criteria for human rights. One more question, in short, one more question seems to later on help the increase of ESG with approximately 5 points. So that seems to be valuable. Obviously needs to be further investigated. That's more or less what we are currently trying to identify. Now, to conclude and to give you some further thoughts about it, it at least tries to fill the gap in literature. Overall, this low-cost element has never been investigated. And of course, to tease in particularly Harm-Jan, our chair of today, also at least signals that maybe the AGM can function, which was a couple of weeks ago in the financial press. You said someone, it's outdated. I know that, of course, it's the journalists that want to say so, want to push you a little bit. I didn't really read that you want to abolish it, but that it is definitely outdated, that's for sure. And I'm certainly also willing to argue with you that it is outdated, but I would really do not like if you abolish it. So let's modernize it eventually, but certainly not get rid of it. Secondly, it seems to be that it has an effect. Still, at least correlation-wise. I'm not saying that, in fact, simply by raising a question, the behavior of shall will immediately change. I don't say that, but it is helpful, it seems to be, to think about it. And in fact, also, when responses are being read, certainly there seems to be some more attention being paid over the year about it. It shows also that the richness of, or at least this bringing in also this novel, more or less, techniques in also making use of language into what we do also as lawyers, bringing it into this sphere of assessment also in corporate governance and in ESG. So from that perspective, I also hope that it can bring some discussion to see whether we can continue about this area. Obviously, we still need to develop some more elements. In order, we have to fine tune it to see to what extent we have to bring in the other questions, because there is many more things that needs to be done. Also to make sure that, in fact, the robustness is there and so on and so forth. But it's the first step that we are trying to take. The next steps is, of course, that we try to, in fact, more in-depth consider answers. Like, for instance, the length of the answer. It seems to be if the chair of the AGM is in favor of the question, it seems to spend more time and elaborate on what is happening so that it could be considered more in detail. Obviously, there are some causality problems. We all know that. But anyway, with some additional robustness checks and treatment and control groups, we do see that, in fact, and we do believe that, in fact, also shareholders should play a major role. Not saying that they should initiate, otherwise Jaap will no longer like me, but I do believe, and because of that they can play a significant role by raising important societal issues also at general meetings in order to make sure that Riens is not angry with us, neither. So we try as ever also to stay somewhere in between. Thanks.
Many thanks, Christoph. Many thanks to all the speakers. And it was good to see that, in fact, we were already discussing with one another. That's exactly what we had in mind. And the camera probably can hear our three eminent speakers. We are ready for questions. Questions from the room here. Questions from the web. Questions from ourselves, and I see that there are many questions, which is good. I'm not sure who was the first, but probably you were the first. We'll get a microphone.
I just have two thoughts about some of the evidence that you have just presented, and I think first would be it'd be useful to analyze changes in in firm outcomes subsequent to the year of the vote. So not just in the year of the vote, but I think looking out, say, 2 or 3 years might be helpful. And it gives a little more strength to it, a causal type argument, and you could then use as a falsification test, reversing that. And looking what happens if you look at the prior year. And the second question or suggestion is to look at who is asking some of these questions to see to what extent is it an important shareholder or important group of shareholders. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Maybe very briefly, absolutely. So indeed, that is we scheduled that we need to take a little bit longer perspective. So thanks for the advice, but that's something that we definitely are going to take on board. The second thing is that we also have shown you indeed that there are different types of shareholders raising questions. And it seems to be the case, at least if we take a look over time, but we haven't, it's anecdotic so far, that indeed when the questions are supported or raised by associations supported by institutional investors, that at least more attention is being spent. And certainly if you repeat these questions, that is something that in fact I noticed, I can't prove it, is differently here in the Netherlands than in some other Western European countries, of which I also have some anecdotic evidence.
Okay, I'll leave it to that. There were basically two themes that you have covered, all three of you. First, of course, is the purpose. What does purpose actually mean? What can it achieve? Yeah, have been talking about it, but also Christoph has raised the question. At least that's what I take from your presentation. That how should the purpose be influenced by shareholders? And I would like to structure the discussion a little bit around those two themes, starting with the purpose discussion. Basically, the points that were made by Mieke, but also the elements that were added by Jaap. Are there any questions on that? Yes. Okay, you were first and then others.
Yeah, thank you. So Jaap, you actually said that there is a very important role for boards because the law is actually not sufficient to get to the purpose of these companies. And so I was trying to imagine, I mean, you have a lot of experience with corporate boards. When you look at these people, and Mieke described basically a little bit the situation in the Netherlands, what do you think is kind of the expertise actually to have this responsibility? Because these people were chosen and raised in a culture of steering companies on financials, and suddenly they need to kind of take into account actually quite a few other elements and even serving a greater community of stakeholders and these types of things. And I'm a little bit concerned actually if you give them such an important role that they simply don't have the expertise, and let alone that they are aware of all the regulations, the whole tsunami that is actually coming to them with all the directives and these types of things.
I have to be very, very strict on time. So I think the question is very, very clear. Thank you very much. No, you won't.
Sorry.
Because then you would have a problem with the chair.
I'm trying. No, obviously you raise a very relevant question. This is not just a question about purpose and stakeholder and responsibility in society. I think all boards of corporations around the world had this question and still have this question on the whole issue of digitization. They had no idea. And it is transforming the nature of our business, the nature of our operations, fundamentally in ways that we still cannot predict. Do boards have the detailed expertise to deal with that? No, most of them do not. Some of them have more expertise, and what you see that is happening, boards are seeking people who have more expertise, who've gone through similar processes, have access to other people who have more detailed expertise, etc. Exactly the same is going to happen on sustainability. It is going to be extremely relevant. The world needs boards who make it extremely relevant for their corporate conduct, to understand what they're doing. And the more regulation comes, actually, the more adamant it is that they do start to understand it. So my to comment on it, the composition of boards will change. It will not be enough to have only people who are financially geared and understand how to produce financially determined value. And there's a second element, because so many expertise in different fields, biodiversity, sustainability, climate, etc., is coming up. We might also consider a notion of that I've developed in one of those papers of what we call X-boards, extended board, that you add people to the board to help you with a specific discussion, not just as a consultant, external advisor who comes in and out, but structurally. You're part of the board, at least for these discussions. You may not have the full responsibility of a board member, but you sit in to contribute specific knowledge that you have on that particular field, which is relevant for the sustainability impact that the corporation makes. So there are different ways to add these levels of expertise to a board.
Thank you very much. Alicia, you had a question as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have two unrelated questions for two different papers. How should I proceed?
Just go ahead. Just go ahead.
Yes. So the first one to Jaap, Jaap Winter. I think you raised a very relevant fundamental issue about the responsibility of the board, which connects with one major finding that emerged in the previous session, namely the work by Amir Licht and René Adams, both in Sweden and then internationally, that it seems that the values of the directors on the board determine more than anything else the outcome in terms the pro-social outcome of the corporation. I asked him a question that I want to ask you because I think the legal details matter a lot here. The values and the identity of directors may be changed by the shareholders who appoints them. The shareholder will appoint them. How do you think the law can limit this in a credible manner?
That is your first question.
Yes, the second one is entirely unrelated. So when you give me back, it's about causality in the paper of Christoph and Anna.
Okay. We will try to postpone that because it seems to me a very difficult question for Christoph. But you can think about it already.
I'll give a long answer again, so you have more thinking time.
Go ahead.
Absolutely crucial, Alessio. I think in my board consultancy work, which is much about board dynamics, board evaluations, board interventions, the core notion that we've developed, that we've come across every time and time again, is board work is human work. It is human work. You have to be a human, a father, a mother, a brother, related to other people, who can sense concerns of other people in order to make the sort of judgments that I think we corporations should be making. That is crucial in the realm, and I come back to the questions about the shareholders. In the realm of just financial analysis, you can imagine that it is just rationality. It's just thinking. But our thinking must be influenced by our values, by our core, by our convictions, what we feel responsible for at a very personal level, regardless of legal consequences. Shareholders determine who sit on boards, ultimately, yes. The selection process is typically not done by shareholders, but by boards themselves in most countries. In Scandinavia, more by shareholders committees sometimes. But in many countries, the selection work is done by board members themselves. I think that gives a lot of scope to present people to shareholders of whom you are convinced that they actually have this sense of what is important for us at a human level for this corporation going forward, and nonetheless be able to convince also to shareholders they are able to make the right sort of balance, which also is good for you as a stakeholder. And to the extent that it is indeed true, and your research indicates it, and what Reens will tell you afterwards will certainly indicate it, that shareholders are also concerned about this. They should not be afraid for directors who really want to take their human judgments into the arena, and they should actually start to value that.
Thank you very much. I still actually was wondering when I read your paper and saw your presentation, what did it actually learn you about purpose? Because you seem to be rather optimistic, but if you look to core issues like climate change, I got the impression that there's not that much. How would you look at purpose also in light of what Jaap was saying?
Yeah, I think if you look at purpose, at least from the part that we found in the Dutch listed companies that we looked at, then there's not much that I see that we can do with that in terms of it being rather broad, rather broadly formulated. And I am optimistic about purpose, but I'm optimistic about purpose if we do it in a way that we say, okay, we have corporate leadership that commits to a purpose, and it commits to a purpose in such a way that you do it through all of through your strategy, through all of the facets. We do it in our articles of association. We do an object clause where we say we commit to a purpose. So in that sense, but that's I think a different thing. Now I have to be a bit careful, because it's not that all of the purposes of the companies that we studied are therefore not relevant, because the part that we didn't study is the relationship between the purpose and the target setting in the strategy, because that was at this point very difficult to see. So I can't say that the research shows that none of these purposes are actually valuable. That is not true. We don't know what the knock-on effect is of the purpose on the strategy and the target setting in those companies.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Questions? There are many questions here. Well, it's difficult to say who actually raised the hand first, but if we limit our questions to, let's say, 30, 50, or 45 seconds, then you may get the floor, all of you. Let's start with Marie. My dear colleague here at the University of Amsterdam.
I get the preference. So thanks a lot. I also have a question actually to Jaap. So what I really liked in your presentation is how you basically show us that over the past 20 years, let's say, we have produced the attitudes in the board that we actually now find. So in some ways, I think that paper goes quite directly against the claims that have been made by, I think, third presentation by Licht, who is very much saying, who is basically looking at the static situation now and saying, people have all kinds of attitude, and it is taking a very ahistorical perspective. So I do think that that is also what I thought your question will be to him. So I would be very curious to hear your reflection on the role of this ahistorical perspective in actually how we go about evaluating and judging what kind of interventions are necessary, and then in turn also, and in turn then also what kind of legal interventions actually, and maybe very strong legal interventions need to come about in order to change those attitudes.
Thank you very much. If you give the microphone to, then we make a round first, and we will see which questions there are, and they will be answered by the panel.
Okay, so actually also two separate questions on each of the papers.
That's right. One at a time.
Okay,
and keep it very short.
Okay, so I'll ask Christopher because you already asked, so I have a question for him as well. But I think it's a fascinating project, and I really enjoy. I mean, the all three were fascinating. I really enjoy hearing it. And it goes back to the question: there are a lot of tools going on at the same time. So the question is how you isolate the impact of the questions versus the impact of. I would think the question is the softest tool here. So there are shareholder proposals, there are withhold vote at the background, there are proxy. I mean, so how do we isolate the impact of this proposal? There are also changes in time. I mean, norms have changed along the time. Maybe what we observe is that the change of the norms and all that. So that's, again, goes to the causality issue, but I think.
Thank you very much. If you give the mic to your neighbor, he also had a question.
Thanks. I mean, a lot of the discussion today seems to have assumed that the stuff that society wants that we kind of know and understand, and which is being prevented by shareholderism. But I mean, the reality is that a lot of these issues we don't make progress on because they're intensely political. And, things like climate don't create trade-offs between shareholders and stakeholders, but create radical trade-offs between different groups of stakeholders, like, developing country citizens versus developed world citizens, people dependent on fossil fuels for their living and those not. And so it seems to me that boards are going to get drawn into massively political decision making if we expect them to solve these sustainability issues. So without some kind of political definition about what sustainability means, it seems to me they're going to be in an impossible position. So how could a political process develop such a definition of sustainability that could be meaningful for boards?
Thank you very much. Then there was a question. Yeah, we will continue. Who actually? Okay, you were first, I think. On the back. Maybe the transfer also otherwise. No, they will take all the questions. They will. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi there, Mart van Kuik from VBDO. I have a question for Mieke. In your research, I saw a lot about task allocation, also for the board members. I was wondering if you, in your research, also looked at remuneration and the incentive for the board, because we also saw at the other presentation with mergers that the board also acts in accordance with the incentives that they have. So I'm wondering how you focus on that part.
Okay, let's take two more questions and then go to the panel. We have one. There's somebody and.
So question for Jaap. I was wondering to what extent you've considered what the Supreme Court, the Dutch Supreme Court, could play in adopting a wider interpretation of who is involved with the company. Yeah, so you listed the decision by the Supreme Court in 2014 when they stated their interpretation of the how the company should act. Mm-hmm. And then there was a quote, who is involved with the company, and whether the Supreme Court adopting a wider interpretation of that could play a role in companies having to act more as responsible citizens.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom Wetzer, University of Oxford. I have two very quick questions for Jaap. So the first is, Jaap, I sympathize with your journey. I think, the focus on shareholderism longer, in the early 2000s wasn't so much wrong, but it was incomplete. What are the lessons that you keep from that journey that you stick to? And the second question is about your open corporation idea. So far, the premise of the conversation has been that a corporation is an independent moral actor and should have a purpose, etc. What's the implication of your open corporation concept for that premise, if any? Thanks.
Okay. Mieke.
Sure.
Yeah, we did look at remuneration as well. And what we saw there was that in our sample, we had 14% of the companies did not have sustainability included or sustainability targets in for board remuneration, any incentives. 26% had it in short term only, 23 in long term, and 37% had it in both short and long term. So yeah, these are a bit the results that we have on the remuneration policies. As to the board composition and the board, how do you get the boards? I think I've already mentioned the extended boards that that you could look at. I think perhaps also board committees. That's also something that we looked at. Sustainability committees. I think this is also something that can be used in addition to having the skills yourself as board members, but that you at least make sure that you have some kind of a committee that does sustainability and that advises the board on sustainability, but also keeps them awake in that sense if there's not sufficient people on the board.
Is that something on the rise? The sustainability
committee? It was quite, at least in our research, we found that it was there are companies that have it, but at different levels. So the majority of the companies that have it in, for example, have it top management at the highest level within the committee. There are only a few companies that, for example, have it as a supervisory board level. A specific committee on sustainability. Often what you hear is that companies say, well, it's a full board thing, so you should do it with a full board, which I understand if you have enough knowledge. I think many boards also have innovative knowledge and actually can do it on various issues of sustainability. But I myself can imagine that sustainability committees could work if you're running behind a bit, or if you think, well, we need to keep everyone awake.
Okay, many thanks. There were a couple of questions for you, Jaap. Yeah. Ready to answer?
Let me try to go. Yeah, I have no idea why the answer yet, but while I'm talking, I might an answer might
summarize it.
Yeah, let's see if I can do that. First question about the historic perspective and what does it mean for us. Two things come to mind. One wonderful book of Robert Reich, Super Capitalism. Some of you may know it. He was one of the in the cabinet of Bill Clinton. And he wrote a book about how super capitalism led extreme financial orientation has come about. In that book, you find wonderful quotes of CEOs of large American companies in the 1950s with a complete stakeholder approach. We are here for the community. Shareholders are one of the constituents that we need to serve. 1950s. The world moves away. Milton Friedman responds as this is an unacceptable, anything goes type of world, and this boards have discretions. We need to focus. So you move in a certain direction. We start to focus. Actually, the Bill Clinton government, Bill Clinton is the cause of our substantive variable pay problem. So that you note, this is something to remember. Bill Clinton is the cause of our variable pay problem. He launched a campaign in 1992 against the fat cats of American CEOs. He said, I'm going to change this. And he introduced tax legislation saying that fixed pay above $1 million would be taxed more heavily. So all American listed companies went to massive variable pay. You will still see it. The remuneration is fixed for $1 million and the rest is all variable pay. It's an unsustainable, inhuman way of remunerating people. We can't simply deal with it, but it has effects. So there's a moment in time something changes, our notion changes, and we move forward with a new type of direction. You may call it dialectics. And if go back to your question about the lessons that I've learned, I was part of a process in which we needed to change the closed shop of directors themselves, judging what's good for the company without any shareholder interference, without any accountability to not even shareholders about why they took decisions that they were taking. We responded on the back of corporate governance thinking, principal agents thinking to, you have to open up to challenges by shareholders. And I think at that time, that was the right type of response to the problem we identified then. I think my lesson has been over the last 20 years that response, if you let it go unfettered, it creates other types of risks that I wrote down in that paper of externalities no longer being responsible for anything else but that financial success that we need to redress again.
we're another moment in time where we need to rethink, how do we balance these two? For me, and that's core in dialectics, dialectics never go back to the original state. The response to this is not to close the shop again and shield away from pressure from shareholders, because it has value. Also, even in sustainability, as you show and as Reens will explain, but to do it in a more broad, open, balanced way that includes interests of other stakeholders beyond the corporate. And we need to figure out how to do it. I'm not the architect. I don't know exactly how to do it, but that's the collective thinking that we need to go through. Your point about what actually is sustainable and should boards make the judgment for the world, what is acceptable and what not, in all the dilemmas and the position that different people from different positions may have against whether it makes sense for them or not, or whether the cost price for them is too high and would be good for others, etc. No, that's not what boards should be doing, but they should be doing their part. Boards are responsible to figure out what are the consequences of what we do. And do we, as humans, find that acceptable? Where is the limit for us in the sort of judgment that we can still justify? And where should we say, no, this is, and lawyers would call it disproportionate or avoidable harm we should actually avoid. So there is a sense, and one colleague in the Netherlands has called this what I call the open corporation. It's becoming the political corporation. To some extent, you have to make those judgments. And I believe it is an illusion to think that we can still have corporations where those judgments are not made and do not have to be made.
Question massive political discussion, like whatever.
Well, to some extent, but you have to take your own position. This is where, and you have to account and explain why you believe this is where your position stops. And you have to allow that your view on that might actually be influenced about what the world believes about that. And to what extent you say, well, this is what you think, but nonetheless, we stay at this court. And my personal sense is, if you do that humanly, reasonably, and are willing to explain it, then most of the time that doesn't pose a particular risk for directors. If you ignore it or suggest that you do it, but actually don't do it, then you run a risk. And I believe you should run a risk there.
Many thanks. The question of Alessio to Christoph, and that brings us to the shareholder. Those of you, Mieke and Jaap, have said relatively nice things about shareholders. And also Christoph seems to have the view that they can be very influential. But I must admit that I'm not sure on the basis of your paper, which is wonderful, by the way. But I'm missing the link that they are really influencing the policy of the company. Basically, that was also, I think, the question of Alessio. Are there, for example, you say, yeah, there are some questions about climate change and companies may do something about it, but at the same time, there's legislation out there. Okay.
Of course, they should balance. And I hope that the shareholders are not the only one in the company that can decide. Otherwise, we do run into difficulties. So I agree that there should be a balance. So from that perspective, I support also the viewpoints of my colleagues. I believe that you should find a balance. The consequence currently is that you seem to almost exclude the shareholders because they come second. Fine, tell it explicitly. I'm not so sure it's going to work, and it's not going to harm significantly also society, that capital will find another way. So here there's a serious risk that you at least also should take into account as one of the stakeholders, the shareholders. But of course, the other ones is more tiny. It's more broadly. Can I abuse my time to at least also raise one question?
Sure.
Because next to law, the next topic to law is liability. I think it's the second word. And I hear also Jaap telling us, yeah, maybe you should also have boards with different types of people that come in, not just as consultants, but really become part if they have specific expertise. First of all, they make use of it a little bit in France, like les censeurs. It exists. It's negatively approached quite often, but the thing is immediately, so from how do you see that in liability issues if you broaden the board from that perspective?
And that was a question to whom? To the general.
Particularly Jaap, but of course also Mieke.
I'm a little bit worried. It seems that I have to protect the applicant. This one seems to be very much important. So, yeah.
Well, there was a slide that I didn't show on the liability risk of boards. My personal sense is that risk is there, but we should not exaggerate. If you look at current liability questions for directors, 99.9% of liability risk is about bankruptcy risk. Creditors not having been paid. Outside of bankruptcy, extremely minimal, if ever. That's where we are today. It's not a complete prediction of where you should be or could be, but that's basically where we are today. I think the law actually provides a clear protection to directors, whether you call it business judgment rules, whether you call it, what would a reasonable director have done in these circumstances? And judges would typically say, if no reasonable director would have taken this decision or have made that judgment or conducted this behavior, then they would say the director is at fault. Before that at fault, there's actually, yes, you can be litigated against. That's part of being a public figure. If you're in charge of leadership of a public company, that's what you get. That's part. If you don't want that, stay out of the kitchen. That doesn't mean liability. It's reputational risk. It's definitely pressure. It's not the liability risk that we as lawyers should be concerned about. Actually, and there are good ways to think about the sort of measures that you should take in order to protect yourself. If you have proper governance in terms of, we specifically pay attention to sustainability questions through a committee or different ways, or expertise that we added to the board. In our remuneration system, we took care of having specific targets, whether you believe variable pay or not, Jennifer. But if you do that and you do it sincerely, you can show that you actually steer in a different way. There are ways to do this that can convince a court that actually we are really taking care of this. We're making explicit judgment. We are willing to explain it, and it's not disproportionate or avoidable harm.
Thank you very much. Back to the shareholders. Any questions on the shareholder side? And probably that was your second question or not? Yeah, there's a question. Somebody
Can I just pay my duty to Christoph? Christoph, you know, I love your work with Anna. I've been following it for years. I'm also very much excited about the shareholders all in this. Although I take Jaap answer, so let's put it like shareholders can always fire them, because that I think is it's much more difficult to rebut. Now, a small technical issue. So the bulk of the international literature has found a causal effect of sheer ownership of institutional investor on the variables you're looking at. So I think I understand that, you know, for your result, I mean, correlation is enough, but you need to find a way to rule it out, because sheer ownership can be directly correlated with the amount of questions, and that basically would make your analysis not credible. So I think you should find a way to control for that.
Okay. We will take some more questions, Christoph, and then you can answer to all questions.
Yeah, short question or suggestion. So you look at the ESG ratings, right, in order to assess whether there was actually a change. But there's a lot of critique on this ESG data. And I'm familiar with the Asset 4 data. I'm not sure if you're using that, but there they differentiate between policies and implementations. And it would be really interesting to see whether there's differences in policies as a response to some of this questioning in the meetings or actual implementations. And one could argue, because it's such a low cost effort to ask questions by shareholders, it's something of a ceremonial act. And similarly, CEOs in companies respond with some kind of ceremonial act.
Yep. Thank you very much. Prince. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you can go first. Oh, no,
You
yeah,
go
then
first
I
and
just
then
have a small suggestion to do with the correlations. So maybe if you can, or maybe you have already observed, if a company jumps in the ESG rating, do you see the number of questions increase or decrease? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I have a question related to that and also to the question raised by Alessio. The AGM is, of course, only one moment of communication between shareholders and boards. And on average, I think executives have more than 300 or 400 dialogues with individual analysts, shareholders, advisors to shareholders. And nowadays the AGM is heavily dominated by sustainability topics, but the other dialogues are also, now I think for more than 50% dominated by financial topics. So I think it would be good to also incorporate the transcripts of analyst calls and hopefully also the reports of institutional investors regarding their engagements with the executives and board directors to have a more balanced view of what has been discussed between shareholders, investor organization, and advisors to shareholders with executives.
Yeah, okay, quick question over there. Mike's coming to you.
One question on the concept of open cooperation. The interests of stakeholders would be taken into account by directors, so included in the corporate purpose. And my question would be, do you think, for Professor Winter, do you think that stakeholders should also have direct rights, so enforceable like voting rights, for instance, in election of directors?
Okay, thank you very much. No other questions? One quick question.
I suppose it's a comment and a question on annual general meetings, which came up. I do think that the annual general meeting is special and different compared to the other dialogue that might happen with shareholders. It's the only time of the year when the full board is present and hears from other stakeholders. I suppose I'm interested to know if you have any initial reflections on the changes in accountability created at the AGM in the COVID era and afterwards, when a lot of AGMs have moved into a virtual or online space or hybrid in the best of situations. I don't know what the situation is in the Netherlands, but certainly in many countries, AGMs have remained online or in hybrid formats, which really changes the dynamic of accountability of shareholders and ability to ask questions and be heard by the full board.
Yeah, clear. Many thanks. And a last question, other chairmen have also abused their position, so that's what I'm going to do as well. If you look at what shareholders actually do in the field of shareholder proposals, you were referring to a great article Michael Bakker published earlier this year. You see that there's very little activity actually from institutional shareholders in supporting shareholder proposals. Isn't the fact that they are posing questions a way out of that dilemma, so they can say, yeah, we did something, but when it really comes to doing something, they do not support shareholder proposals. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, to a large extent, many of these things are more or less comments to see how to proceed. So we'll take them all on board. Yes, I'm familiar with this for it. I think we can include it, and it's a very good remark to indeed differentiate between policies and implementation. So thanks for that. Also, to overcome the problem of correlation, it's a very good one. The AGM is absolutely one specific moment of communication. And we'll try to figure out to what extent it will be possible to include other mechanisms that are being used that I showed also, whether it is possible to integrate that. One of the features that we do know is that there are pre-meetings taking place, sometimes also to prepare. So currently, and unfortunately, due to that they are invisible to a large extent, that makes it very hard. I know Marco Becht did some research on that and got some cooperation, but it's for a large number that we are investigating very tough to introduce. Absolutely, in fact, we only have taken a look. The majority of the questions are, until today, not focusing on ESG. They're still focusing also on finance. So absolutely, will put forward, but it's a tremendous amount of work. The amount of questions that are being raised, in particularly also over here in the Netherlands, to identify all different types of questions and see whether it is. With respect to changes in COVID, very interesting. So far we couldn't identify, we didn't check in detail whether for the 2021 meeting and the 2020 meeting that is in our database, there is a major change here in the Netherlands. Because I know I see it also, that there are tricky issues going on, in particularly in the US, by moving to, in fact, what most of the companies like, the hybrid or eventually the full electronic version of the meeting, because they could escape a lot of questions. And I remember I watched it even also at Berkshire Hathaway, that it was announced when opening the meeting that there are 2,500 people that had remarks and questions. As you know, the speed currently of Mr. Buffett, at which he is in answering the questions. I watched it also this year, 2022, 6 hours. I think it took 5 questions in 6 hours, no, in 4 hours. So, yeah, so at least at the AGM, you can't escape. So I haven't noticed in any way so far that it happens here in the Netherlands, but definitely something that is of a concern. But in all honesty, to wrap up a little bit, these are all questions that that answers that I also, due to anecdotic evidence that I have, and also attending in quite a number of meetings in earlier days, not or largely unrelated to what we are investigating.
Yeah, understood. Many thanks. Last question. Any rights for shareholders to, and that's basically my interpretation, to decide on whether sustainability should be a subject, to what extent, etc. Any views on that?
Well, I understood the question somewhat differently, whether stakeholders should have a vote in the governance. Isn't that your?
Oh, stakeholder. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay,
two brief comments on that. Some companies have experimented with what they call a societal council, representatives from different stakeholder groups in a sort of advisory capacity. And I think that's going to build up. I'm working with one corporation in the Netherlands now who's going to make this potentially a sort of general meeting in which there are shareholders, but also other stakeholders, not about the typical corporate agenda in a shareholders meeting, but about impact. On core issues of impact, we want to hear from all our stakeholders and be advised by all our stakeholders what they think is important or not. So that's one thing that's happening. The next step, or a next step, could be, and I've been thinking and working with some clients about imagining this, could we create a different corporate structure, which I've called multi-stakeholder cooperative? There are cooperatives, so not corporations, cooperatives, who have different categories of members, each having voting right and sometimes distinguishing between the voting rights of different memberships, capital providing members, employees as members, customers as members, societal organizations as members, each having some sort of say in the governance of the organization. This happens in Canada, in northern Italy, in some industrial businesses. So it's not just agricultural, industrial businesses who took a very different take on how to engage stakeholders in your governance. Can be developed.
Okay. Well, that's something that we can discuss in the break. We will have a break now, and we will restart 4:30, I think. So in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much.